Hello, it's so great to see you today. My name is Dr. Kayla Stoltenkamp. I am the owner of Mind Over Matter Kids. We are a tutoring center. I do some special ed advocacy. I work with doing some screenings for students who might possibly have dyslexia. I'm the former president of the International Dyslexia Association, and I really work hard to help advocate for good literacy practices and to help teachers and families and students learn about what dyslexia means to them and how to get help in the school. So today I'm going to be talking to you about what's it mean to be dyslexic in Kentucky. So let me share my screen with you. Here we go. All right. Oh. So we're going to talk real quick about what dyslexia is, the reading brain, what is the diagnosis and who can diagnose, dyslexia in special education, more specifics about what it means in Kentucky, and then structured literacy, so the approaches that help, and then some contact information if you have any questions. So dyslexia, which is this definition, I should say, is adopted by the state of Kentucky. It's also adopted by the Federal Department of Education. So this is a definition that is recognized both in the state and at a national level. It is the International Dyslexia Association definition that was approved in 2002, I believe. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that's neurological in origin. It's characterized by difficulties with accurate or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. The difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities in the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension, reduced reading experiences that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So it's a very long definition. To break it down, we know that it's neurological. So we know that it's something that's happening, a difference in the way that our brain is processing language. We know that it's typically seen when students are having difficulty with decoding or recognizing those letter sounds in words. It often is a result of the phonics or the phonological awareness aspect, and that is when it's unexpected. So they've been getting good core instruction, but they're still struggling with picking up some of those foundational skills in reading. And because they're struggling in reading, they have some secondary consequences, such as reduced reading, fluency, and vocabulary. And all of those build when we become better readers. So once again, deconstructed, it's a language-based learning disability. It refers to a cluster of symptoms. So it's difficulties with language skills, particularly reading. And usually students with dyslexia experience difficulties in language, such as spelling, writing, and pronouncing words even. So they might still say like Paschetti or things like that. Sometimes I include a little comic just because I could get a breather then. So we know that dyslexia is very complex, and there's lots of great videos out there that you can watch, or there's great articles that you can read about the reading brain and how our brain processes what we're reading. But we know it's complex, and I'm not going to get into all of it today. We know that continuous research is being done to sort of map the brain so that we can pinpoint what areas we're using and how we can improve or enhance those areas for students that are struggling. And we know that dyslexics have a unique reading brain that requires a structured approach to acquire the language. And so we know that there's the typical reader and what their brain is doing when they're processing their reading and their language. And then we've seen that a dyslexic brain, their neurons are traveling a lot of times on a different pathway. So when I talk to parents or sometimes students, older students usually, I will tell them that most readers take the expressway to read. They hop on the expressway, they read it, their brain processes it, and they come back on the expressway. For students with dyslexia, that expressway was not built, and it likely will never be built. So they take back roads. And the more structured literacy and the more interventions they get, they can start to create shortcuts so they can take the shortest route to their destination without taking the expressway. So we know that dyslexia can't be cured, but we can change some of those pathways, and we can help make some of those connections for students with dyslexia. So in 2018, we really pushed for a bill that would address dyslexia further in Kentucky. So there has been a bill for quite some time that required Kentucky to really identify, not really identify, but to use the word dyslexia underneath that specific learning disability umbrella. And in 2018, there was another piece of legislation that came out called the Ready to Read Act. And the Kentucky legislation adopted the IDA definition that I told you about. It did require pre-service teachers to learn about dyslexia. So for example, I teach at Northern Kentucky University, and I have to teach all pre-service teachers about what dyslexia is, sort of what sort of characteristics are there. If they're showing these characteristics, do we think it's dyslexia or not? So they read the toolkit. And then we find some good lesson plans and interventions that we can do with that student. It also provided some guidance that schools may use. And so this is a big part of the legislation that I think we need to understand. The legislation has a lot of great information in there about required screening for younger kids and required interventions for students that are maybe at risk for dyslexia. But when the legislation was going into its final draft, that word shall got changed to may. And so what it means is that schools may choose to use this guidance, but they might not. So sometimes I like to say, like, I may get up at 4:30 tomorrow and work out. I usually don't, but I may, you never know. And so I think that's where we want to continue to push legislation so that hopefully we can require it rather than suggest it. They also created a toolkit, and that can be found on the Kentucky Department of Education website. There are other states who have some really phenomenal toolkits out there as well that go into a little bit more depth. So if you're really looking for a good toolkit, maybe check out the Arkansas one, or Indiana has a good one. Kentucky's is a good one. It sort of explains a very brief overview of dyslexia, but they did publish it, and all teachers have access to that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that all teachers across the state were required to read it or anything like that. KDE was required to put it together and to publish it on their website, and they did do that. So there's another little graphic for you. So dyslexia diagnosis, what is it, I guess? In Kentucky, you will not be diagnosed with dyslexia at a school. They can evaluate for a reading disability, but they will not diagnose dyslexia. And that comes down to the fact that they really aren't meant to diagnose anything. Schools are meant to describe what the difficulty is that the student is having. So let's say that a student had Down syndrome. They would not qualify under the Individuals with Disabilities Act under that term autism. Down syndrome. They might qualify under a mild mental disability or an intellectual disability or multiple disabilities, things like that. So they will not necessarily be diagnosed or identified necessarily in the school system by their initial medical diagnosis, but they are diagnosed and sort of labeled, and they qualify for special ed under one of the 13 umbrella categories that the IDEA has determined. So dyslexia falls under a specific learning disability, traditionally in reading, but sometimes in writing or in math. There's 8 different categories under SLD. So if you want a diagnosis of dyslexia, you have to go outside of the school system, and oftentimes you have to pay for that. Now, I will say, if you have a evaluation at the school system for a specific learning disability in reading, and you don't believe that that evaluation had enough information in it for you, you can request what they call an IEE, an individual education evaluation. I'm going to go with that, but it could be something more specific now that I say that. And the school district would have to pay for you to do an evaluation outside of the school. So if you take that route, you could get an outside diagnosis for free. But traditionally, parents who suspect dyslexia for their children will look in a nearby area for somebody who does diagnose. So who diagnoses dyslexia? Usually it is a psychologist. In the state of Kentucky, the psychology board requires a licensed professional. So you might have a speech and language pathologist who's licensed. You might have a psychologist. It could be a medical professional. Most pediatricians don't diagnose dyslexia, but you can absolutely talk to your pediatrician about it. And a trained educator might be able to, depending on what their certification or license is. What should they look for? So we want to look for a background because we know it's a genetic disability. We want to sort of take into account their cognitive abilities. We know that IQ and dyslexia are totally unrelated, but when we look at their cognitive abilities, we can figure out some of those working memory, processing speed skills that might help us to identify further what they're struggling with, and could it be a delay in, this or that. So it just provides a little bit more information. We want to look at their oral language, their word recognition, their coding abilities, their spelling, their phonological processing, rapid automatic naming, reading versus listening comprehension, because a lot of the times those will be a big difference. And then we want to look at vocabulary. So if you're asking your school to do an evaluation for a learning disability, we want to make sure that you ask them to do all of the subtests that are provided, or you should at least ask for these specific ones because you want information in these areas to be able to look for dyslexia. When should you get the diagnosis? I used to go back and forth with this because it is expensive. So I used to say, like, if they show the characteristics, then we can provide the interventions without an official diagnosis. However, if you wait too long to get an official diagnosis, you might not be able to get those accommodations or the help that you need on certain assessments, such as the ACT or things like that. So I would say as soon as possible. Now I've changed it to as soon as possible in terms of a diagnosis. If you want to try to get some more supports at school or something like that. Also, people discuss age, and there's actually no set age. There's been research to show that you can diagnose dyslexia as early as 5 to 95% accuracy. So if you go to somebody who really knows what they're looking for, the age doesn't really matter. As long as they're 5 or above, because we're looking at that language component. Can they rhyme? Can they, break apart words, things like that. So sometimes we can see risks for dyslexia, or we can see that language deficit or difference before they even begin to read. So sometimes schools can provide screenings, so a little short test to sort of see, do they have a red flag or do they have some characteristics of dyslexia? But a formal diagnosis really has to be done by that licensed professional who I was saying. And once again, the schools won't diagnose, but they will describe. So they will call it a specific reading disability. They will not say dyslexia. They could say they have characteristics of, but most school psychologists are not trained to look for specific disabilities. Why should you get a diagnosis? Well, it helps to understand and meet their needs. It also helps them to get accommodations. So I will also say down here that states have an obligation to ensure that evaluations of children suspected with having a disability are not delayed or denied because of an intervention. So, or an RTI, same thing. So if you want your school to do an evaluation, you have the right to request an evaluation. And I can absolutely send you a draft of a letter that you could send to your school to say, I would like my student evaluated in the area of reading. A lot of the times the schools might write back and say, well, your student is getting interventions in RTI, and so we cannot evaluate until we see what kind of progress they're making, or they're already making progress, and so we can't evaluate. And there is a letter from the Office of Special Education Programs that says you cannot delay an evaluation for an intervention. So you can begin the evaluation. An evaluation at a school takes 60 school days typically. And so during that 60 days, they can collect that intervention data. So feel free to ask me if you need help with any of that or have questions. So in terms of dyslexia and special education, so this is my opinion, and I always say this as a disclaimer, just because there's lots of different perspectives, and so this is just mine. But I believe that if we have the right core instruction and interventions in K through 2, most students with dyslexia are going to get those strategies that they need, and they won't have such an adverse effect on their education that they would need to qualify for special education. So if they're being given the right instruction and they're learning the strategies that they need, I do not believe that they would have such an adverse impact. Now, I believe that they absolutely need supports and modifications throughout their whole life, and that's where the 504 comes in. But really, the point is to give them good instruction. And so if we're doing core instruction correct and we're giving them interventions when they need it for the skills that they need it on, a lot of the times they can learn what they need to be okay readers, maybe even good readers. It might take them a long time because we know that it's always taking little back roads. It's not taking the expressway, but they can learn that skill. However, a lot of the times our core instruction or our interventions are not working for our students, and that gap grows bigger and bigger and bigger, and they will need to qualify for special education because their needs are not being met in the school system. So if their needs are being met, the interventions are being given early, they really won't struggle to the point of special education. But a lot of the times that's not happening. And when that gap grows, we know that their needs aren't being met, and then they should qualify for special education. So without the right interventions or the right instruction, I do believe that a specific learning disability, oftentimes in reading, basic reading fluency, is what your student would likely be identified under. Now, when we talk about special education, there's two types. So an IEP is under what we call IDEA, which I was referring to earlier. And if you qualify for a specific learning disability in reading, then you would be given an individualized education plan. So we have to say that dyslexia has an adverse effect on their academic progress. Schools have to have a lot of data, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But if they have an IEP, then they're given interventions, they're given a specific goal, they work with a special education teacher on those goals to grow, and they have accommodations, they have modifications, all of that kind of stuff. If you have a diagnosis with dyslexia and the school says you don't qualify for an IEP, or if you do an evaluation and you don't qualify for special education, you might be able to qualify under a 504 plan. So that one is under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that is really just a document that's providing your child with modifications that will help them, or accommodations that will help them succeed. It has to show that dyslexia substantially limits a life activity, and reading is in there. So this is the longer definition, that they have they must have a mental impairment or physical impairment that substantially limits at least one, and reading and writing are both in there. So if they have a 504, they might get things like extended time, testing in a quiet location, audio books when needed, individualized spelling tests. Some of those things could come under a 504. And when I had mentioned that I don't believe that all students with dyslexia need to be serviced under an IEP, I believe that they likely will all need a 504 because they're always going to need extended time. That's something that we know is not changing neurologically. They're not going to take that expressway. So there are some accommodations that will likely be needed to support their success. And so that's where I think a 504 is really important if they don't qualify for an IEP. So to qualify for an IEP really depends on what school district you're in Kentucky. So some school districts use a discrepancy model and some use the RTI model. I have sort of issues with both, so it really just depends on the conversation we have and how your school district approaches it. What I will say over here, this is referenced, and I should have cited it, but the National Panel for Literacy Learning Disabilities, NCLD, National Council for Learning Disabilities, and they did an evaluation of all of the states and their percentage of different disabilities. So they looked at the percentage of specific learning disability and other health impaired, which is oftentimes where students with ADHD will qualify. And what we found is that what they found, I should say, is the national average of students that qualify for SLD is almost 39%. But in Kentucky, we only qualify 19% of students. So that's a huge discrepancy. In Kentucky, we are not qualifying students to the same rate as our neighboring states or our states nationally, which just makes you wonder. Another thing I will say is that the discrepancy model uses a specific table that people in Kentucky have created. So they look at your IQ score, and then they look at how the student did on their reading assessment that they did. And if they made this cut score, if they scored lower than that, they say, yes, they had a discrepancy, and so they qualify. But if they didn't make that cut score, then they won't qualify for a disability. And the difficulty with this is they're looking at one assessment, really. That's the main data they're looking at. Now, a lot of the times they'll look at other data, but that discrepancy number is the most important number. And it could be that your student was pulled to be assessed by a person that they didn't know, or they were assessed, right before lunch. And so they might not have been given their full efforts, or because they were testing one-on-one, they did really well because they love the attention and they love having, that one-on-one interaction, and they really were focused and they did super well. And that's not typically how they do when they're in the classroom with their peers. So that one number that they get from that assessment determines if they qualify or not. So that's the discrepancy model. And I believe that, like, the Kentucky Department of Education and the table that has been created, I honestly just need to understand more information, and I've tried, but I just think it's interesting that our percentages are so much different than neighboring states. The other way that some districts qualify students is that response to intervention model, which I was referred to a little bit earlier. So the student has to be in tier 2 for a decent amount of time, and they have to be in tier 3 for a decent amount of time, and they have to do interventions to determine if they're making progress. So they're trying to teach your student these reading skills. And if they're making progress and they're learning, what the schools say is they don't really need special education because they're learning what they need to in the interventions. And so really they wouldn't need to qualify for special education because their needs are being met here in RTI. If they're not making progress in RTI, then they say, we've tried to provide them all of these different strategies and they're continuing to not make progress. So we suspect that there's a disability and they need to be serviced by the special education teacher. So if you have dyslexia and you have an outside evaluation and you take it into the school system, we know that they might look at the discrepancy model or they might look at the RTI model to see if your student qualifies under the specific learning disability category. Now, I didn't add this slide in here, but when you bring an outside diagnosis into the school must consider an outside diagnosis. So they don't have to accept it and give you an IEP. They have to consider it, and then they have to evaluate to see if that disability has an adverse effect in the classroom or in the school system. So just because you have an outside diagnosis doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get services. And that's where sometimes you have to call in an advocate to get some extra help. Now, hopefully you advocate for yourself, and there's lots of extra resources out there to give you tools to advocate for yourself or for your child. But if you have an outside diagnosis, the school must simply consider that diagnosis. And I also say, let's go back to my workout metaphor. They have to consider it like I consider working out at 4:30 in the morning. So, if I'm super active and I'm trying to lose weight for the summer, I might consider that a lot more often than right before Christmas time and it's nice and warm and I'm enjoying my Christmas cookies that somebody dropped off. I probably am not going to consider it as highly as I might have before. And so some school districts really utilize those outside diagnoses and maybe even use some of those same scores when they're doing their evaluation. And other school districts or other schools don't necessarily put a lot of weight into those outside evaluations. So it really just depends on your school and what they're going to use from that evaluation. It also depends if they're using discrepancy or the RTI model. And those are great questions to ask when you're trying to get an evaluation or a diagnosis of dyslexia or specific learning disability in the school system. So a lot of times schools will say, well, we don't recognize dyslexia, or we can't put dyslexia in an IEP. And that is incorrect. They actually can put dyslexia in an IEP. And there was a letter from the Office of Special Education Programs, and it's linked here, but you can also just Google it as well, and it reiterates the fact. So I just quoted it here. There is nothing in the IDEA or implementing regulations that would prohibit the IEP teams from referencing dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia in a child's IEP. So if you have an outside diagnosis and then they also qualify under the reading disability, they can say that they have a diagnosis of dyslexia within the IEP. And so if a school is trying to say they can't put that in an IEP, that is incorrect. And there is documentation out there to support you in asking for that. Another comment that comes up a lot is dyslexia and ADHD. And the two of these sort of differences or disabilities, whatever you'd like to call them, I like to say they're best friends. So it depends on which one you have or which is your primary disability. But between 30 and 50% have both. Because they're neurological differences, a lot of the times they're using those same side roads, I want to say, to process information, to pay attention, all of those types of things. So sometimes the schools say, well, we can't really evaluate, or the student doesn't qualify because we believe that their behavior is causing them to have difficulty in learning to read. Other times they'll say, you know, we don't really suspect ADHD because they're struggling to read, and so they are behaving because they're trying to avoid reading. So it's like, which one, I say the chicken and the egg, like, what's the primary disability? Does it really matter? If the student needs help in both areas, we need to make sure we're providing them interventions in both areas. Now, when you go to evaluate, you truly can only evaluate one or the other. And in specific learning disability, there's a whole statement that says, you know, it's not due to behavior or instruction, things like that. So if there's if it's suspected that behavior is an issue, they do have to disqualify that student. But there is response to intervention that can be provided for behavior and for reading. And so make sure that if they suspect or you suspect that they might not qualify because of this chicken and egg situation, ask the school to provide and collect data on both reading and behavior. So just another statement about that. That's a little quote there, or a little comic there for you. Okay, so what works? If you have a student who is suspected to have a disability, and I've been talking about this RTI system, so we're going to provide interventions. What kind of interventions do we be providing? We need to provide interventions that follow a structured literacy. Sometimes people use science of reading, Orton-Gillingham, there's lots of phrases out there. They need to use a specific approach to actually help the student make progress. And so if they're not using this intervention, it's important to say that the interventions need to meet the needs of the student. So I always sort of refer it back to like kids' medicine. When your kid is sick, they give everybody amoxicillin for an earache, but sometimes that doesn't work. So you have to go back for a heavier antibiotic. That's sort of what RTI is. So, but some schools say, well, our tier 2, everybody in tier 2 gets this intervention. And then everybody in tier 3 gets this extra intervention. But the problem is sometimes the intervention that they're picking for their tier 2 or tier 3 isn't really appropriate for students that have a profile of dyslexia. So that's a good question to ask. And if they're not making progress, it could be because the school's not using the right intervention for your child. They really need to be using a structured literacy approach. And there is lots of information out there that you can find. I'm going to just go over it briefly, but this graphic can be found online, but the intervention needs to be cumulative, it needs to be explicit, it needs to be diagnostic, and then you should be working, or it should be working on all of these different skills: phonology, sound symbols, syllables, morphology, syntax, semantics, lots of different things. So we want to make sure that the intervention program that your kid is getting is including all of these different skills. Really, these are just quotes that say, you know, if we follow structured literacy, we will be applying empirically supported best practices. We know research is showing that this approach does help students with dyslexia. And so it's most important that we really make sure that our interventions are meeting the needs of our students. So structured literacy is an approach. It's not a program. So if you ask your school about intervention programs, they might say things like fast forward or leveled literacy or reading recovery or Orton Gillingham. All of those things are there are programs. I'm sorry, Orton Gillingham's an approach. All those are programs. Structured literacy, like if you go to your school and say, I want my student to be getting a structured literacy intervention, they might say, we are using Orton Gillingham based approach, or we are using a certain intervention. That intervention might actually be following a structured literacy approach. And there's ways to find that out. So structured literacy is an approach. It's not a program. And if you do have an IEP, they oftentimes cannot put a specific program within your IEP, because if you move schools and that school doesn't have that program, then they can't provide that accommodation. So they'll say something like, given structured literacy interventions. And structured literacy is just sort of that umbrella to make sure that they are including all of these things in the intervention that they're providing your child. Another comment or caveat or red flag sort of thing is to make sure that the teacher who's providing that intervention is adequately trained and continuously trained. So if they received training 3 years ago and they haven't had follow-up training in that intervention, I would ask, what kind of follow-up intervention or training are you giving to make sure that the intervention is being implemented correctly? So that's just another thing to keep in mind. My contact information is Kayla at mindovermatterkids.com. So you are welcome to email me if you have any further questions, or if you want to talk about anything, if you need more resources. The other thing I wanted to share with you is this idea of, you have an evaluation, but your child might not qualify. And these are just some things to keep in mind. I had worked with a student recently who had this sort of, we had this discussion. So I went to a meeting with a family and I was advocating on behalf of that student. And the school district brought their due process attorney, and we were all sitting around the table. And so we know that he has dyslexia and he was evaluated. However, on his evaluation, he scored around the 85 area on different things. He didn't meet the discrepancy model. And they said he was making progress in his RTI. Now, the discrepancy model, this district used RTI, but they were saying that he scored in the average range. So when you look at his scores, an 85 to 115 is considered average, above a 115 is gifted, below an 85 is considered below average. So the student had some 85s. So I was saying, well, yeah, but he's very close to below average. And the attorney was like, but he's not, he's average. And he's making progress in his intervention. Well, let me explain this to you. They tracked the data on his progress according to the program that they were using. And so really that data shows that he was progressing through the program. So he completed lesson 1, and then he completed lesson 2, and then he completed lesson 3. So that data was sort of going up. He's making progress. The progress data that's collected needs to be something that's outside of the evaluation or outside of the intervention to see if he's really generalizing what he's learning in his intervention to his reading skills. So that's another thing to be cautious of when you're looking at data. Another caveat that they said was, well, he's performing in the average range, so he doesn't show an adverse effect on his academics. He has all C's, and C is average. So I said, C is average to who? Well, nationally, they just consider C to be an average score. And I said, well, let's look around the table. We're all parents, or most of us are parents or teachers or whoever. And if your child or your student came to you with a C, would you consider that good, average, he's doing okay? Or would you say he's struggling or maybe needs some support? And the attorney said it doesn't matter. A C is considered average and it doesn't show an adverse effect. So I said, okay, well, let's look at this class. Let's look at the 4th grade class. What is the average grade for his class, his peers that he's in school with? What is the average for their group? And is he part of that average, or is C below average for him? So we looked at some of the data a little bit differently. Now, did he qualify? No, he got a 504. But that following year, we went back, we looked at the data again, and it was determined that, he did qualify because it did have an adverse effect. So sometimes you've got to make sure that you're really looking at the data the right way and using the right data to support it. That's really all. This got really long-winded, so I apologize. Sometimes I just get to chatting. Please reach out if you have any questions, if you need help, if you need resources. I am happy to help you, and I hope that you have a great day.